Welcome to a special podcast series, Breaking the Silence, Canada's Classrooms of Injustice, a series that delves into the stories about the federal day school system, produced by the Legacy of Hope Foundation with the generous support of the Indigenous Screen Office. Over the course of 8 episodes, we'll hear powerful stories and reflections that shed light on the often overlooked impacts of the federal day school system on Indigenous peoples, families, and communities. Join us as we listen, learn, and honor the stories that must be heard and must never be forgotten. In this first episode of the Day School Series podcast project, host Gordon speaks with Dr. Jackson Pind. Jackson is a mixed settler Anishinaabe scholar and assistant professor of Indigenous methodologies at Trent University. Jackson is co-editor of Spirits of the Grassroots People, Seeking Justice for Indigenous Survivors of Canada's Colonial Education System by the late Elder and Dr. Raymond Mason. Jackson is also the lead researcher for the digital mapping project of federal Indian day schools in Canada, which links library and archive files to the relevant 699 day schools found on the interactive map. You can visit the map at indiandayschools.org or find the link in our episode show notes. Please enjoy this highly informative and enlightening episode.
Hello and welcome to this podcast series on the federal day school system through the Legacy of Hope Foundation. Our guest today in this podcast series is Jackson Pind, a professor at Trent University, Ontario. Welcome, Jackson, and happy to have you with us. And how are you today?
Hey, Rich. Thank you for the invitation. I'm doing well. How about you?
Good. Maybe we could start by just you telling us a bit about yourself, your nation and family background. If you have any indigenous roots, please feel free to let us know.
For sure, yeah. So, Ani Bojo, Jackson Indigenous, Ma'ingin Indo Datum, Nagodrawanan and Donjabas, and Zaga Ingan, and Michisagi Anishinaabe, Nini Zaganash. So, hello, my name is Jackson. I'm from the Wolf Clan, and I was born and raised in Peterborough, or Nagodrawanan, which means the place at the end of the rapids. And I'm currently calling you from just outside of Kingston in Syndham, Ontario. And I do have mixed Anishinaabe and settler ancestry. So my Anishinaabe side comes from Alderville First Nation. That's through my mother's family. And then my father's side of the family is a bunch of different European nations like Ireland, Finland, and Denmark. And kind of where I'm situated between here, Kingston and Peterborough, is really the traditional homelands of the Anishinaabe, but especially Alderville First Nation. They were actually in Kingston. Many people don't know, before John A. Macdonald and before colonization, they're kind of just north of the Kingston area. And were forcibly pushed to Alderville First Nation, which is just south of Rice Lake and about half an hour outside of Peterborough. So I'm kind of right smack in the middle between those two areas, and that's where I live and work today. And yeah, I've kind of been doing a lot of this research for my own self in some way, trying to understand my own family histories. My own family are the Marsdens from Alderville, which was a very popular and still prominent name in that community. And my great-great-grandfather was chief of Alderville First Nation. His name was Moses Marsden, and he made the decision in 1909 to enfranchise, which means he gave up his right to be Indigenous under the Indian Act, to leave the community at that time, and move us just north of Peterborough in Lakefield, where my grandfather still lives. And some members of my family have been able to regain status recently over the decades as they made changes to the Indian Act. My mom is hopefully next on that list. She recently got a letter from Indian Affairs, I guess, that said the new bill about, I think it's Bill C-35, about reinstating enfranchisement makes her eligible, but it is unfortunately on hold right now with the new government change. So we'll see if I become a real Indian, I make the joke about, or I'm still one of these non-status individuals right now as a result of colonialization. So for myself and my research, that kind of spurred me to kind of explore more of that. I think Moses was one of the only chiefs to actually make that decision to enfranchise, and that came with a lot of benefits, but also obviously some significant drawbacks as well with our culture and language. So yeah, good for that.
Yeah. Well, being Indigenous really is, in your heart, right? You know it, and that's what's most important. So And I don't know if I've ever been to Alderville. I think we passed through there a couple of times on our way to Toronto. So I've never been there actually, but I think we passed around it. So, and
Yeah, if you drive through now, they have this really big war memorial kind of right in the middle of town, and you might
yeah,
remember that. And that was actually the first war memorial made by Indigenous people on a reserve, and it looks a lot different than a lot of other war memorials. It was
yeah,
much different
yeah.
imagery. So if you ever do drive by, you'll kind of know by the big kind of towering monument right in the center of the community there.
Well, if we go to the elders uh, workshop gathering, we'll certainly go to your community. It's not too far from there, so we'll take a drive out there and check it out.
Perfect. Sounds good.
How did your journey in education lead you to working in the federal day school research?
Yeah, so I started off my education going to Laurentian University in Sudbury, which was for me the far north, but it was really not that north at all. It was about 5 hours north of Peterborough. And I started there my undergrad in 2011 in the history undergrad, started taking courses, really exploring the history of Canada. And then when the Truth and Reconciliation reports came out in 2015, I started reading those as part of some of those classes and was introduced to both residential schools, but also the history of Indian day schools and well. And what was really, I think, frustrating for me as a young person trying to find my identity and more about our history was that all of that information was never talked about. And if you read the first pages of that TRC report, it really talks about Alderville First Nation, as Alderville was one of the first residential schools in the country. It was
Well,
founded in the really early 1840s, and then quickly spread across the country. And to me, that was never talked about, ever understood, or how that might have impacted my family and why we might have left the community voluntarily at that time because we had both a residential school in the community as well as an Indian day school, and how those two forces were really
yeah,
assimilated at that time. So that's like
yeah,
something that really started my journey, I think, into the history of this field. But then specifically the day schools, I became more and more frustrated as more stuff came out about residential schools, that day schools weren't being talked about whatsoever. They're kind of put on the back
yeah,
burner in many ways, especially post TRC because of the, I think, warranted attention on the residential school history. And then one summer I was going through, I kind of tell this story where I was working a job I didn't really necessarily like, and I had a lot of free time to go on the computer. And I kind of just started going through library and archives, just as a historian does. And I kept finding all of these day school records that connected to local Anishinaabe communities in Alderville, but also in Curve Lake First Nation, where I grew up outside of Curve Lake. So I have some ties there as well, and where I've done most of my research over the last decade or so. And I started looking through these files and seeing the exact same experiences that was going on in the residential schools. And that really, I think, started my journey into working on the day school research and starting to bring more attention to, I think, a very understudied portion of Canadian history.
yeah. Uh, I don't want to guess why your father, your grandfather moved, but there are incidents where they were forced to go to residential schools. Kids were, and in some cases, residential schools were actually like in your case, in Alderville, there was a residential school where people actually from the community went to the same school, which was, I guess, a combination of a day school and a residential school, because the residence was beside the school, uh, was detached from the school. Actually, the school that people went to, the students went to, and there was a mix of students that lived in the residential school and kids that lived in the community, but that went home at the end of the day.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah, and I think Moses Morrison had 13 children by that time period. And what myself and some other people in my family believe is that he wanted to remove those kids from that system. He had experienced a similar type of education and made a call that it was better to leave at that time period and take
yeah,
his very large family with him. I'm not sure if you know Morris Switzer at all. He's a treaty educator, but he's also one of our relatives here. He wrote the book We're All Treaty People. And I've done some kind of conversations with him. He kind of has the whole archive to try to piece some of that together. And I was able to reconnect in many ways with our family, trying to put these stories together, which again were really not talked about growing up. It was something, again, once we left, we kind of, I wouldn't say abandoned our identity fully. We still understood we were Indigenous, as you said, from the heart, but really talking about it openly, I think, was something that was not really encouraged at that
Yeah,
time.
yeah, a lot. That was pretty common back in the day when for whatever reason, people choose not to talk about their native ancestry. So I guess there was a lot of discrimination, and I think schooling had a lot to do with it too. Kids being sent away to residential schools, and to me, I think that was one of the reasons why, because I have a lot of friends who did go were sent away, and but also a lot of kids that were not, their parents actually moved them to the trap lines and places to hide when the federal agent came around. But yeah. Anyways, I don't really want to get into the residential schools thing because this is a day school project, and but we there is a bit of an overlap, and we'll get into that a little bit later. Um, the other thing, you also did some digital mapping project on digital mapping. Can you tell us a bit about this?
Yeah, so this project started after working with the late elder Dr. Raymond Mason, who maybe we'll talk about later as well. But it was really his idea to try to make kind of a digital map of the day school, supposed to be used for educational purposes, but also for researchers and survivors who were applying at that time for the Indian Day School class action lawsuit that had been launched around 2019 officially. It just ended actually in 2024, but there was an extension into 2025. And that project really was his idea at the start. He said he wanted some educational resource where people were actually online a lot. He saw that through his grandkids, they were going online and schools and wanted kind of a free and easily accessible site where people could explore this history. So it was really his original idea. And then myself and one of my colleagues at Queen's at the time where I was doing my PhD, Benjamin Farmer Lacombe, who was the kind of computer wizard, I would call it, the computer scientist that made it possible, kind of came together to really create this map. And it was a very small grant we were able to get from the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, as well as an internal grant from Queen's to help pay for the site and start developing it. And we basically first started with a map of Canada, what is now Canada today, and started labeling all the Indian day schools that were part of the class action settlement. So over actually exactly 699 Indian day schools. So we got that kind of raw data from the settlement and then started placing them across the country where they were located. So that was a big job in itself because sometimes the actual location of the school has been lost or it's very vague. I remember a couple of the examples were 20 miles down this river on the west bank of this side. This was where the rough school was. And we tried to place them as close as they were to the original places. And then after that, we basically went through and actually started attaching Indian Day School records to those schools specifically because the Library and Archives of Canada had a website where you could find about 800,000 different documents related to Indian Day schools. But those documents were not really organized by school. They're organized by kind of Indian agencies, is what they're called at that
Mhm.
time period. So they're all kind of combined together and very difficult to find unless you were a historian or knew exactly where to look. So we kind of took all those files, separated them, and then attached them to the actual school names, and then
Yeah.
kind of did some more kind of digital mapping on top of that. So we have a cool feature where if you go to the website and go into the top kind of right-hand corner, there's a search bar, and you can type in any city, postal code, or town, and it'll take you to the closest Indian day school to where that location was. So that is really a cool feature, I think, for students, and it really shows them how close they are to an Indian day school. And I think a lot of students, especially in my classes at Trent, are kind of blown away by that. They grew up their whole lives and don't know that Indian day schools were a lot of times in their backyard. For Peterborough, for example, where Trent is, only 14 kilometers away was the Curve Lake Indian Day School. And students start learning about that. They can then click on the actual school itself and learn about when it was in operation, who was in charge, what religious groups were going on at that time, and then also look at the archival documents of what actually happened in the school as well. So it has been a huge kind of undertaking to create the website, but we're really encouraged by students using it. Researchers have used it, as well as communities who are kind of piecing together their Indian day school histories. I think right now it's had over 25,000 views since it's launched just a couple of
Wow.
years ago.
Wow. When did the day schools begin to appear, and what year did they end? And was there any overlap with the residential schools?
So you could argue in some ways that the day schools were always kind of a part of Canada's colonial project. In many ways, the very first settlers wanted to start kind of schools, and Indigenous people at the very beginning also wanted schools as well. They understood that there's this new culture coming, and they wanted to be educated in both their traditional ways and also kind of Eurocentric ways that were coming in. And there are some, I won't call them positive examples, but examples of some cooperation in the early 1800s where First Nations actually worked with different mission groups to have both kind of traditional education along with some missionary education. There's examples in our territory where some of the Methodists converted their books to Anishinaabe Moen so that it would be kind of be able to taught to these individuals. But that really quickly changed, I would say, around the 1840s and 1850s, and then into what would become Canada when Canada was formalized, and to a more assimilative nature that's similar to the residential school project, where they were trying to remove the language and culture of Indigenous peoples. And officially, again, it started roughly in the early 1840s, but officially Canada took control of these schools in 1867 during Confederation. And then the last school is something that we don't fully know the answer to. I tell people, I think it's hard to know the exact date of when it's closed. You could argue the very last one was around 2000 or so when some of the schools were transferred over to First Nation control. But right
Right.
now, as we speak, there is an Innu Indian Day School lawsuit happening in Newfoundland over day schools that occurred in that province. And in that province, the last one officially closed in 2009, if you can believe that, which was very not that long ago, obviously. So there's still lots of more work to be done. They were unfortunately in Newfoundland not included in the Indian Day School class action lawsuit because at the time they were officially not part of Canada because Newfoundland joined Canada much later, right in the kind of end of the 1940s. But now they've started their own lawsuit that's going to be heard in September of 2025 here, and hopefully they'll be included as well.
What was the purpose of establishing day schools in indigenous communities?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think kind of goes back to the other question too about the overlap of the residential schools. So there was a very strong overlap. It was run by the same federal government, the same Department of Indian Affairs, and then administered in their day-to-day operations by the same churches. So the Roman Catholic Church was the biggest. They had over 300 Indian Day schools. Then the United Church had about 120 or so. And then it goes down to all the other churches that were involved as well. And the main purpose, I would argue, is to remove Indigenous peoples from their lands and force them onto their reserve communities, as most of these Indian day schools, or almost all of them, were on a reserve. And when they were forced to attend these schools, they were not on the land no longer. And a lot of my research I did for my dissertation and an upcoming book I have with Curve Lake First Nation, we really show how this process was really interlinked with the early treaties that were signed at that time, as well as the removal of like lands and especially in the Williams Treaty, hunting and fishing rights, which was the only treaty in this country where those rights were extinguished, unfortunately. Well, not actually extinguished, they were regained just recently in the settlement, but the government believed that they had basically taken them from the First Nations. And by having this reserve and having this day school and making sure their children would be at these institutions, they could then assimilate them into Canadian culture, which at the time was, again, Anglo-Saxon, and really this new economy, I argue, that was happening in Peterborough. There's General Electric and Outboard Marine were the two big industries, and if they could assimilate these students kind of through this manual training type education with a heavy focus on English and no culture or language, then they could have these new workers that would come out of the system ready to be now seen as kind of Canadians that were assimilated into this new state. So that would
Yeah.
be my perspective of their whole purpose. And there's been a lot of research behind trying to show how that happened, and not just this area, but across the country as well.
Yeah. Sounds like there's an element of, trying to control the people and control the direction of their lives as opposed to their traditional ways. I know that in some places in the Arctic communities, because um, the Inuit used to travel on the land and move from place to place. So they wanted them to move into the communities establish schools and housing and and that kind of stuff to basically keep control of them and get them into the Canadian system. So
Yeah, there's a lot of sad stories, unfortunately, in the farther north. I just saw recently in March there was the Inuit dog sled settlement where the
water, yeah,
RCMP, yeah, slaughtered 20,000 Inuit sled dogs, and then they were not allowed to travel any longer. Put a
right,
school in that area and kept them on that very small piece of land, again, to control them and make sure they weren't going outside of those areas, which again all shows the links between the colonialism that was happening and the day school, which was, I think, a central part of a lot of these activities as well. Because once you had the children in the day school, right, their families were most likely going to stay there as well because their
right,
kids were right in that situation, and they wanted to be by them clearly as a result of other things that were going on in the country at that time.
yeah, yeah, for sure. Um, what role did the Indian Act play in the schools, being established?
Yeah, so the Indian Act in many ways was kind of the foundational legislation, and also as it expanded and changed over the years, ways to control Indigenous people in the school. So it mandated attendance in an Indian day school or residential school around 1920, which again obviously forced way more students to be actually going. If you look at attendance records from our website and also in the archives, you can see how those attendance records start kind of shooting up right after that time period. Before that, a lot of parents would hold their students back, but they're at the risk, especially what we found in Curve Lake, of being sent to a residential school if they didn't comply with the demand to go to an Indian day school and attend basically every day. If you missed even a few days, they would have the truancy officer start looking and kind of reporting on your absences. The Indian Act, as well, I would say, also introduced the pass system, so you couldn't leave the reserve unless you had a pass from the Indian agent, which again restricted your movements and forced you onto the community as well. And if you're going to leave, which a lot of family members we see in the archive, which I think was surprising for a lot of historians, is that in the archive, it's not just the story of Canada's control of Indigenous people, but actually the resistance of Indigenous communities as well. There's hundreds of letters from chiefs and councils kind of complaining about the quality of teachers, complaining about the less lack of control over what was being taught, as well as hundreds of letters from family members as well, asking for, again, a better teacher or opportunities to leave the reserve school and go to a better public school that they knew was just off the reserve in the nearby, you could say, white town or settler town. And we found lots of those examples that really showed they understood the Indian Act, how powerful it was at that time, but were doing their best to try to navigate some of the restrictions that were in place as a result of the legislation at that time. So I think it
Yeah,
was very important to understanding how the day school worked is to understand how the Indian Act was enacted, and then quickly how the changes to the Indian Act really changed what the school would look like as well. I think one of the best examples that I know of in Curve Lake First Nation, for instance, is the change in 1951 to the Indian Act where women were now elected or being able to be elected as chiefs of community. So Curve Lake actually has the first Indigenous woman that was elected as chief. Her name was Elsie Knott, and she was
mhm,
elected just 2 years after the change in 1953. And what she actually decided is she was going to make her own language programs that were going to happen in the school building, but after school hours. So it protected a lot of the language and culture there. And then
yeah,
she eventually actually decided to create her own bus line called the Knott Bus Line to actually move students away from the Indian Day School into the nearby public school. And there's a really funny story a lot of survivors have told me about how the very first bus line, she couldn't really save up the money for a full bus. Instead, she actually bought a old funeral hearse and then used that funeral hearse to get the kids in the back and then move them over to the local school, which again provided way more opportunities for the students, as well
yeah,
as give them opportunities to go to high school, which at this time period the school was kind of limited to grade five. So people would be done
yeah.
in grade five and then off to kind of work, and now gave way more educational opportunities. And I think the changes, as you saw from Indigenous resistance, the Indian Act opened up these opportunities for really brave women to do this work that was happening
Yeah.
right now.
So she moved the students from her community by hers to a school in the town away from the day school. Was that what you said?
Yeah. Yeah, away into it was a nearby town of Lakefield, actually, was the very first one. Then it slowly started building up the bus line. The bus line actually still operates today as not bus line. She was
Yeah.
able eventually to buy a bus and start busing them in at that time period. But it provided way more opportunities for the students because they saw a lot of students believed in education. They just didn't believe in that very assimilative, one-sided education, right? And then she also
Yeah.
opened up more programs because she was a fluent language speaker, and her story is real interesting as well because she kind of missed the day school experience because she was really sick as a child, but she didn't go until she was basically 10 years old. So she still had her language and culture and saw how valuable that was and was able to open up after school programs for the youth, kind of using classes to entice them as well as language classes and have a lot of language and culture there in Curve Lake. And if you look at the number of first language speakers, even in comparison to Alderville and my community, there's way more in Curve Lake. There's still about 30 remaining, which is quite a lot for Anishinaabe nations that are still first
Yeah.
language
Yeah.
speakers. And the language is coming back quite heavily now. And that same day school building now has been converted to a kindergarten to grade 3 class, and it's basically focused on language and culture, which I find very beautiful. There's a few examples of that across Ontario, like the Tyndonega Indian Day School is now a Mohawk language kind of learning center, and communities have reclaimed these places to actually
Yeah.
show how important their culture and language are.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned something about the chiefs in back in the day writing to, I guess, the government about the lack of good teachers, lack of proper facilities, and stuff like that surrounding the school, the day school. Um, well, I went to a federal day school on the reserve, and I can really understand this because I used to wonder why, like when I was in, we went to grade 6, and I was an A student in grade 6, one of the top students, and then we were sent off to residential school. This was a day school, and this federal day school, so we were sent off to residential school in Dauphin, Manitoba, and we went to the local school, which was the town school, which would be under the province, I guess. Um, and I struggled, like when I went there, I had a really hard time. Like I had C's and D's, from a top student to, and I couldn't understand why. But later I realized that the education system on the reserve was probably a year behind, maybe longer, and in terms of the level of education that the kids were getting on the reserve. So. That's quite and now I know, I understand why it would happen there. So,
Yeah, that was a very common experience for a lot of students. And unfortunately, the teachers we found were also very uneducated and also didn't many times have qualifications. They were basically, if you were affiliated with one of the churches, you could be hired, even if you had no educational background. What
well,
and was really frustrating for Curve Lake as well in this local area is we had a kind of Peterborough normal school. So we had a teaching instructor college, basically training first class teachers, and they were actually prohibited from going to the Indian day schools to gain their necessary practicum experiences. So no first class teachers would ever go to the day school because that meant they would actually not get the highest qualification for them to have further jobs. And then we
yeah,
also looked at the sad part was the funding of the teachers, right? And if you look at the funding compared to a provincial school teacher, an average salary was about $400 a year for most of the Indian day schools in Ontario. And if you were outside of an Indian day school, that funding was about $800 a year. So what kind of teacher would want to go get half the price
yeah,
in a
yeah,
remote community, maybe not know anyone, live in a remote area many times where the day schools were located on the reserves,
hmm
with way less pay. And you can see the type of people that were attracted to those jobs were not the type of people that were good educators, that were actually passionate about teaching and were making
yeah,
reasonable money to keep employed. So there's always this constant rotation of terrible teachers. And we looked at some of the teaching records that are in the file, and we find a bunch of really horrific examples of teachers. There's one teacher that, again, a lot of the community members didn't remember, but was an investigation was done on this teacher, and they found he was actually training a circus bear in class rather than teaching the students because he worked in the circus in the summers. So he brought a live black bear into the class, trained it during the day, and then would have naps basically when the students were there because he didn't really care about teaching. And then during the kind of seasonal circus fairs, he would take the bear out and make extra money on the side. And that was one of the teachers that was employed. He actually was not even fired for that after the investigation. They just sent him to another reserve farther away. And that would typically happen again and again and again. The teachers were never really fired. They were just moved around once complaints came forward. So that was an extreme example, but it's one that I've seen multiple times in many different communities. I'm sure you might have similar
Yeah.
stories of teachers that were not passionate about teaching, that weren't really there, just trying to get some type of paycheck because they couldn't be employed anywhere else.
Yeah, yeah. And I noticed that a lot of teachers, like when I was there going to the day school, we'd have one teacher for 1 year, and then the following year we'd get a different teacher. There was always like constantly different teachers coming there for 1 year, and then they'd leave, or 2 years at the most, and then they'd leave.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and they'd leave for usually better opportunities, right? Because once you t taught for 1 year, you could kind of claim you had like this some
hmm,
form of experience, and then because of like the wars that would happen, and a lot of the time they were looking for male teachers. That was like the prime candidate they could find. They didn't really believe women could be the best teachers at that time period. So if you were a male teacher, you got 1 year experience in Indian day school, you could be offered maybe double the salary now into a public school, and you'd easily leave the next year. And that happened time and time again. And that was a lot of the complaints from chief and council and parents saying we need a steady teacher that knows who we are and understands what we want out of our students, and to have that consistency because most Indian day schools were all in the same class, like grade kindergarten to grade 6 or grade 5. And if you have a teacher that's there for the whole 6 years, you can form a much better relationship with them, right? And being able to trust
right.
them,
Yeah,
progress through the grades. But a lot of students, and you might have experienced similar things, is that you basically restart the same kind of reader book again at the next year, basically.
mhm,
A lot of students say they'd get to grade 3 and they'd just be stuck in grade 3 because the teacher would be like, okay, we're just going to start again because I don't know what happened last year. There's no
yeah,
tracking of how the students were doing.
right. Yeah. I also noticed that the teachers never really got involved in community activities, like whether there's a square dance going on or something going on at the band hall. They were never there. They just stayed in their little compound and never participated in community activities.
Yeah, that happened a lot in Curve Lake too. A lot of them would complain. Actually, one teacher one time did participate in the Christmas concert and was dancing, and they got reported to the Department of Indian Affairs and got reprimanded because they were being immoral and were not allowed to dance with the Indians, is what they
Okay,
said at
yeah, that
that
was
time
probably a
period.
rule then that
Yeah,
it
it
was
was
not.
definitely a rule because they didn't want to, I think, form closer relationships and bonds. They wanted to see we are the power in the state here, and you're the people we need to rule over, and we can't kind of
Yeah,
interact. It's almost like the king and the peasant kind of idea is that we're not going to work with people that are lower class to us, basically, is what the files indicate. And what was frustrating about Curve Lake in particular was that there was an Indigenous teacher that usually came in and saved the day when a teacher couldn't be hired, they couldn't find someone. They would always hire this man named Alfred McHugh, and he would come in and basically save the class for that year. Multiple times he'd come in with like a month left of class, or if they couldn't find someone to open the school in September, he would teach for a couple weeks. But he was always paid half of what they were being paid. So he's only being paid like $150 to $200 a year, where all the other people that were incompetent teachers that were not teaching and doing well were paying doubled of him. So he was their last resort. I said in the book that we've been working on is he kind of saved the school in many ways and helped some students progress to the higher levels. But that was
yeah,
also very rare as well because it was very clearly indicated they said they did not want Indigenous teachers. That was the last resort. They wanted basically white English speaking teachers above all else, and
yeah,
especially those that were connected to the missionaries at that time.
yeah, yeah. How were the obviously the government funded the development of these schools, and there was also I mean there's been talk about this thing called the Indian Trust Fund. I'm just wondering if that was part of it, because the Indian Trust Fund was established to do infrastructure and to provide funding for indigenous communities. But I believe now, just maybe I don't know if you've done any research on this. Maybe you could just clarify this with us in terms of where did the money come from to fund these day schools?
Yeah, so the funding is a quite complicated story, and at times it's hard to know the real answer of where the actual funding was coming from because a lot of those records have been destroyed or they're not actually kept that well. And I know the funding of the Indian day schools was, I wouldn't say a priority of the government, but it was something that was carefully scrutinized and analyzed throughout the entire time as one of their operation. There was always fights over how much was going to be paid, when a school building would be implemented, when new infrastructure would be developed, when even the smallest little things like how much money you spent on chalk and how much money you spent on paper was spent. And then if you spent too much, the government would get the person in trouble and back and forth. There's actually some records in Curve Lake that talk about how one year one of the teachers bought 7 different brooms at 25 cents a piece. And the government was mad, saying you're only allowed to have 2 brooms a year at 50 cents. Why did you spend so much? And the teacher had to write back saying the floor is in such terrible condition that it wrecks my brooms every time I try to sweep. So that's why I had to buy it. So it was very to the minutia dollar, basically, or the smallest amount was actually really focused on the funding of the schools. And from my analysis, especially because I've worked so closely with Curve Lake, I've looked through basically the funding that happened there. The funding was in some ways split 50-50 on a lot of the big things. So when they had a new teacher, for instance, and they wanted to pay them a bit more to attract a better teacher, they would sometimes use band funds, which I think was code for the Indian Trust Fund. That was money that was supposed to be kept aside for First Nations and used for their own purposes. And some of that money would be pulled from their own Curve Lake funds. And then the government would front the other half from, I'm not exactly sure. It could be, again, from that same Indian Trust Fund where they're double dipping, or from like a parliamentary budget kind of finance office where they're approving spending on Indian education at that time. So it is really hard to know the exact answer to that question. I do know the government was funding a lot of the kind of upfront costs on developing the school and creating the curriculum and making sure that the bills would be paid. It all went through kind of the Department of Indian Affairs to get your pay. But the exact amounts and the percentages, I think, is still a question for us to fully uncover. I do think the Indian Trust Fund was involved. And what's interesting about Curve Lake First Nation as well is that after the Williams Treaty is signed in 1923, which was a massive treaty in central Ontario and was actually the last kind of historical treaty that was signed between the Canadian government and First Nations until the 1970s. The First Nations then have some more money that they're able to use and try to push the government, say we want to spend more of these funds, which were First Nations owned funds that were from the treaty settlement, right? Like that was not supposed to be fully used. The government was supposed to take care of them now because they entered into this treaty agreement. But since they made some funds through that agreement, they wanted to actually take care of the school, and they start petitioning the government multiple times to create a new school building. And that wasn't created until right before World War II in 1939. So about almost 2 decades later is when they finally got a new school building. And at that time, the new school cost about $11,000, which is equivalent to about $250,000 today. But again, once you look through the records, the school was really cheaply bought. Basically, every time they tried to ask for more stuff like better pencils, a better furnace to keep the students warm, the response from the government would always be, okay, the Indian agent, you can go look for kind of some of these supplies, but always find it at the lowest cost possible. And that caused huge amounts of headaches you can imagine with furnace issues, closing the school because the furnace wasn't working, leaks that were going on, all these issues with the bathrooms and toilets because they weren't kept clean or not actually built properly at the time period, as well as some hidden costs as well. So once they created the Indian Day School in Curve Lake, they actually tested out a new septic tank system. It was one of the first of the kind. And even the chief engineer wrote to the Department of Indian Affairs saying, we're going to just use this as a test case or really an experiment to see if we can save some money at all the other Indian day schools. And it basically failed drastically in the community. The first week it was open, they had to close the school, the brand new school, because it stunk so badly and that students were getting sick basically being in the classroom. And that was actually never really fixed. They basically decided to just scrap that plan. They kind of experimented and they found we're just going to bury the septic tank and make some outhouses. And that, to my knowledge, is still buried there in the community. And that obviously has lots of ramifications for even today, right? There's still water boil advisories in many of these communities, including Curve Lake. They're part of one of the the lead plaintiffs against the Clean Water Drinking Settlement. And in some ways, you could connect that directly back to how these septic tanks were treated way back in the 1930s. So there is always these kind of hidden costs as well, I think, that were associated with the day school that weren't really fully explained to the First Nation. So I don't know if I have a full answer on exactly how it was funded. I know the government usually funded at least 50%, and usually First Nations would have to chip in to get better quality services if they wanted, like a better teacher, for instance, at that time.
Tell us about the late elder Dr. Raymond Mason. Who was he and what did he do?
Yeah, so he was an elder from Peguis First Nation, and I tell the story of when I met Ray. It was kind of a really chance encounter, to be honest, and it really changed my life and the direction that I was working on for this history. At that time, Kevin Lamoureux, who was the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation education liaison, was basically going to universities and talking about the TRC calls to action. And he came to Queens one day and gave this guest lecture. And I sat through the lecture and I was a little upset because he was only talking about residential schools. And I went down after and I said, could you talk about, why didn't you talk about Indian day schools? That's what I've been kind of researching. And I think it's just as important as the residential school stories you were telling me. And he basically looked at me and told me that that story had not been told yet, and instead gave me the name of Raymond Mason. He wrote down his phone number and said, call this guy and you'll find everything you need to know. And I basically one day called him up randomly, and that was February 2018. And I gave him a phone call, and we really talked for about 4 hours or so about his own history growing up in Peguis First Nation in Manitoba, his own experiences of going to three different residential schools, but also a day school as well in Peguis. He went to Berto Residential School, Portage La Prairie Residential School, and Dolphin McKay Residential School, all in Manitoba. But before he went into those schools, he had also gone to an Indian day school, and he really did not like the Indian day school experience. He was really far behind because he had suffered from tuberculosis, and he was really singled out as a student that was going to be sent away to the residential schools because he was so far behind, and they needed some more, I guess, attention on his story. So his whole life story was basically really shaped by those experiences. They really, unfortunately, shaped him in many negative ways. He would openly admit at the time. After he left the school, he talked about how he suffered from residential school syndrome, where it was a form of PTSD, and had really struggles on the streets of Winnipeg. For almost a decade there, he was homeless and struggling with addiction, and was in and out of the justice system. And then, really, a chance encounter in 1986 changed his life. So he started this group with survivors. He went into a coffee shop and found a bunch of other survivors that he had recognized from those schools. And they started drinking coffee and talking about trying to sue the federal government, which at that time seemed like an impossible idea, to take on the government and actually sue them for what happened to them as children. So
Yeah.
they slowly started gaining a lot of support. They founded this organization called Spirit Wind, which would become one of the largest residential school and day school survivor organizations in the country. And by 2006, when the residential school settlement agreement was just about to be finalized, this group came to Parliament and kind of testified in front of the House of Commons. And basically, from if you look at some of the records and their parliamentary record of what they talked about, a lot of the MPs were really upset about what they had heard from those survivors. Michelle Jean and the Prime Minister both came up and said, we're going to promise to you that we're going to get this settlement figured out. And the very next couple months is when that settlement was reached. And they were one of the groups responsible for bringing about that settlement in 2006, which was the largest settlement at that time for residential school survivors, and has led to the TRC process. But Ray was actually pretty upset with how the TRC process unfolded. He was really upset with how residential school survivors were re-victimized through the independent assessment process, which is a whole other story we won't get into today. And instead, in 2009, started to launch the Indian Day School settlement with his friend Gary McLean, who became kind of the lead plaintiff under that case, called the McLean Day School settlement. And that one again went another about decade or so, 2009 to 2018. Just a few months after I started talking to Ray is when that was finally settled. I remember him calling me and said, turn on CPAC right now. I'm going to be on the news. We're going to announce the day school settlement. And I saw him on TV with Carolyn Bennett that morning when they announced the day school settlement was finally reached. And another $1 billion settlement for day school survivors would come forward. And that was a really emotional time for him. He felt like he had finally done a huge victory. But again, he was already thinking about other survivors that were not actually included in that one as well. There's also boarding home students and day scholars and other lawsuits that were still going
Mm-hmm.
on at that time period. So the last 2 years of his life or so, we started working together on an autobiography as well as our website that I talked about earlier in this conversation. And I basically recorded his oral histories and then wrote it up into a book. He had been working on a book for about a decade before that and hadn't really made too much progress. And I thought I could help him kind of push it over the line with some of my research and history background. So I added his oral history into his kind of narrative, and then I added a bunch of footnotes, about 300 footnotes or so, just to kind of get more context into his life and his legacy. And that was published just shortly before his death in March 2022. So he has now passed away, sadly, but before he passed away, he was actually honored with an honorary doctorate from Queen's University. So he passed away as both an elder and a doctor, which I think he was really like bragging to me about that, how he had both of those kind of really high honors in both kind of worlds. And what was really nice about that at Queen's was at the time Murray Sinclair was actually the chancellor, and Murray actually gave him that honorary degree. And it was a big moment for Queen's as well because the very first person to get an honorary doctorate was actually Sir John A. Macdonald back in the 1840s, no, 1860s or so. And Ray was one of the people to kind of hopefully end that kind of circle of now recognizing some of the people that Macdonald and others had tried to really eliminate through the residential school. So it was really a huge honor, probably the largest honor of my life to work with Ray and to know Ray and publish his book called Spirit of the Grassroots People. And his legacy is still something we try to uphold now with our website and a lot of our teaching that we do at Trent and also across the country on day schools. Because I think without his work and other survivors' work and actually bringing those settlements forward, we would not be having these conversations this morning. I think it was all really on the backs of survivors that really fought against the government and really fought against government lawyers in many ways to make these conversations possible. So yeah, I'm really proud to have worked with him, and hopefully I'm doing his legacy justice.
Well said. Yes. How, like, with all the stuff that's gone on with the Indigenous people in the last, 100 years or so, and the day school system, the residential school system, but more specifically the federal day school system, and how do you think, how important is it for Canadians to know that this actually happened?
Yeah, I think it's really, really important. I think as a duty, as I think most Canadians, if you're coming to this country, you should learn about the day school system. I think that's something we try to focus on at Trent here. I teach the Indigenous course requirement now, so all students have to take an Indigenous course. I teach the Intro Indigenous Foundations of Reconciliation 1001, which has about 600 students per term. And we talk about the day school system and we talk about the residential school system and we make sure people know about this history. And if you were to, I usually do this in class, I say, just as a show of hands, who has heard of the residential school system now? And almost everyone puts up their hands. It's pretty encouraging now. I would say
Yeah,
maybe 90 to 95%. And then I'll say, who has heard of the Indian day school system? And maybe less than 5% put up their
yeah,
hand. And
yeah,
those 5%, if you were to ask them, it's probably because their parent or their grandparent went to an Indian day school. That's really
right.
the only way they have heard about that. And I think there is this large gap here between the two systems, even though I really argue they are two sides of the same coin. It was still the same government, the same churches that were funding them. And I think it's really essential that Canadians understand both their legacy and its ongoing impact today. I think what was really important about the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report was that there was a whole section dedicated to that, basically saying that the violence that is occurring to Indigenous women and girls today is a direct result of both residential schools, the 60 Scoop, but also Indian day schools as well. That violence that was learned in the schools was sadly passed down and inherited through Indigenous people as a result of these experiences. And in order to address these massive causes, including that Indigenous women are 12 times more likely to be murdered than any other group in our society, we need to understand our history and how to kind of confront that 101. And that's really important, I think, at Trent when we have people like nurses that are coming through our program and going to be dealing with Indian day school survivors that might be going through a mental health crisis, social workers that are dealing with Indigenous people on the daily, as well as a whole bunch of different other careers like teachers as well to make sure that students know about it. And I think I find that as my I would say most important role right now as a historian of day schools is to really connect what happened in the past to the present. And there is still so much we need to know about the Indian day school system. There's only been a few studies actually about certain different day schools across the country, and we need to focus more on really the whole system as a whole, I would say, and how these legacies are still unraveling right now. We still have lots of survivors that are still with us, and while they're still with us, we need to make sure those histories are preserved.
I was just thinking while you were talking about these lawsuits that are going that are like still going on today, um, and the survivors or the people that did not survive, they, it's unfortunate that they were not able to be recognized and to be compensated for the hardships that they went through. Um, what I wanted to ask you, I guess we're getting close to the podcast here. What are your feelings and thoughts about the status of reconciliation in Canada?
Yeah, that's a fraught word right now. And the course I
Yeah.
teach is Foundations of Reconciliation. I struggle with that. I tell students with it, I'm not really sure where we're really at. And this year for their final exam, I actually asked students this question. One of the final exam was, I said, some Indigenous people believe that reconciliation is dead in this country. And do you believe that? And if you read through all of the responses, I would say maybe 25% of people believe that reconciliation is dead, that it's over, that it's not really going to be fully recognized as a result of a whole bunch of things that they listed, like how many calls to action have actually been answered. I think only 13 of the 94 have now, over a decade since the TRC was first introduced. And then on the other side, there is a group of people, I would say as well, that have some hope behind that, that there is some belief that there is possible a way forward. And I think I think more on the side of hope than just complete despair. I think we all have to have a little bit of hope. I think that's where a lot of our belief comes from, that there is a path forward here. And I think when Murray Sinclair passed away, in many ways, I think he would want this story to keep going. And Murray was a big actually advocate for day schools. He talked really openly about how day schools should be included in these conversations about reconciliation. And he was also concerned about how the lawsuit was prohibiting survivors from actually getting full justice and recognition because they had to find their own documents, they had to apply by themselves. Some of them didn't even know the lawsuit was going on as they're not connected to online or Facebook, or even recognizing that the day school experience that they had was something that was worthy of compensation in some way. So I do think I have a little bit of hope that reconciliation is moving forward. But I do think we need to keep holding our governments to account. And in many ways, that term has expanded. And I think if you look at the 232 calls to justice for the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls report, none of those really have been fully implemented. And I think both the calls to action and the 232 calls to justice both need to be implemented in order to say that we're on the right pathway and we have a future. But I do find some hope in the youth as well, that they are really pushing forward and trying to make the changes that are happening. And I think if you looked at Ray Mason's life, the lifetime that he had from when he started in kind of the late 1950s, going to a day school, to what he achieved by the time kind of the early 2020s, I think there is definitely progress that has happened and there's change that have definitely been ongoing. And at least we're recognizing some of the harms that have happened. This is always, I think, a constant struggle in this country. And I think we're going to be defined by that by at least the next 150 years, because it took 150 years for this to happen in the first
Yeah,
place.
yeah, for sure. There's people that have different views about reconciliation, and there's so many. Um, but what I wanted to ask you before we close is, for clarity for our listeners, what are the calls to action? I mean, I don't want you to list all of them, but what was the reason for them, and what is the call? What are the calls to action, and how did it come about?
Yeah, so the 94 calls to action were implemented as a result of the kind of Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That was a massive report that basically outlined what happened in residential schools. And if you read some of the reports, there's also a bunch of references to day schools as well, how they interacted between them. It's not just residential schools. That's kind of a misnomer, I would think, in some way. But the calls to action came as a result of that and have areas for our country to address, such as in education and healthcare and justice. Those are the three ones I think I focus on the most, as I'm an educator, and I feel like those are the ones we need to really look at. And again, there was 94 all laid out. I encourage you to go to Beyond 94, which is a website designed by the CBC to see the progress and where these are actually being faced. I personally would like to see another TRC process happen for just day schools exclusively, as well as some calls to action directly related to the Indian day school system. These ones, the calls to action are more broadly about just kind of the society at large, but I think there are some ones that we can really address within education from the day school system, including still the underfunding of First Nations education today, which is really insane differences between a provincial school in Ontario, which is about $16,000 per student, with a First Nation school in Ontario, which only gets about $5,000 to $6,000 per student. And that massive gap obviously causes massive generational differences over the quality of education and the types and levels of education you can achieve. And I do think there's a process that can unfold similar to what happened with the TRC with residential schools, but focused on day schools as well. Because currently, as we're speaking, the federal government has made a plan in the last federal budget with the Trudeau government to implement $25 million to digitize 6 million archival documents. And it's not clear yet where those archival documents are going to go, if they're just going to go into storage for 100 years until they can actually get accessed, or if they're actually going to be used to kind of understand how the system was actually working. And I really hope those files will be released to the communities to try to piece together more of this history that right now is unfortunate a black box, because between 1950 and 2000, we really don't fully know what happened in the Indian day schools and how they worked, how they operated, and how they eventually were integrated into public schools, because that information has been locked for privacy concerns, which I understand, but also has been very difficult for historians to understand what happened. We have to now just rely on oral history, which is very important to understanding the experiences, but we don't know what happened, for instance, with behind the scenes with the church and government and how they were interacting in that time period as well. So I kind of, as my final statement, think we need to keep putting pressure on the government to release those documents and return them to their right holders, which are First Nations across the country.
Yes, very well said, Jackson. I want to thank you for taking the time to talk to us about what you know, your knowledge as a scholar with regards to the day school system in Canada. Is there anything else that we might have left out that you'd like to mention, touch on before we close? This is the last question.
I would just try to pay attention to the ongoing lawsuits. The day school lawsuits aren't over. There's one in northern Quebec right now that's happening at the Quebec Supreme Court, as well as in Newfoundland, that will be heard this fall by the Innu Nation for recognition of the harms that they occurred or their students and families occurred in their Indian day schools. And unfortunately, they have not been fully recognized as having Indian day schools. For a long time, I actually said, oh, there's no Indian day schools in Newfoundland, which is a mistake on my part. And I think we need to make sure we're fully recognizing the wide extent of that system. So I'll just say, try to pay attention to these ongoing news stories. If you just Google Indian day schools and go into the news feature on Google, you can see some of the recent stories that have come up over the last year. And there has been ongoing fights to extend the lawsuit to give more time to survivors. And unfortunately, the federal courts have ruled against that so far. But I think the more pressure that we have against that is really important. And then kind of the last thing as well is that there is the McLean Day School Settlement Corporation, which has been created as a result of this settlement. And there's supposed to be $200 million that will be spent on healing, reconciliation, as well as kind of commemoration. And I'd like to see a lot more of that happening right now. And so far, there hasn't been really any formal guidelines of when that funding will be spent. But I think we need to look into where that will be spent, how that will be spent, because right now there's basically no commemoration about Indian day schools. Just in Ontario, for example, as a kind of quick aside as we wrap things up, if you look at the kind of Ontario heritage plaques, if you know those plaques that are across the province, those blue plaques that talk about our history, there's a bunch of them at residential schools like the Mohawk Institute and Shinwalk Hall, but there's zero plaques actually about Indian day schools in Ontario, which I find quite shocking. And I think really shows our lack of historical awareness about these institutions. And I think we can do better in making sure we talk about them. So, miigwech, thank you.
Thank you very much for taking the time to do this, Jackson, and we wish you all the best in your future, wherever that takes you. And on behalf of the Legacy of Hope Foundation, I want to thank you for taking the time to do this with us. Thank you.
Miigwech, thanks.
Igusi, Maga.
Thanks for tuning into this special podcast series on the Federal Indian Day School System, produced by the Legacy of Hope Foundation and made possible by the generous support from the Indigenous Screen Office. This series deals with difficult subject matter. The Hope for Wellness helpline is available 24/7 to Indigenous peoples across Canada and can be reached at 1-855-242-3310 or available through chat at hopeforwellness.ca. Counseling is available in English, French, Cree, Ojibwe, and Inuktitut on request. For more information about the Indigenous Screen Office, visit iso-bea.ca.